impact of the military gondola itself that stuck with me permanently. And as I remember, the only Japanese aircraft that ever had the black circlet around the rising sun. And the gondola attachment itself to the triple dirigible system was painted black on the top. The rest of it was kind of a neutral base off silver white. The Americans, of course, took their examples of gondolas and they spray painted them over into very drab American colors so that they would not be noticed in terms of any national markings. And these were what the Americans were working with in terms of perhaps replacing the biocidal weapon system with a nuclear weapon. And so in terms of Roswell itself, Roswell was obviously 100 miles south of Los Alamos. Roswell was right near Alamogordo and White Sands missile testing range. It was just, they were just south of Roswell. So this was the perfect area in which to test it. So responding to Cyberbian in terms of why would the Americans allow foreign prisoners up in the air with an active nuke near any civilian population, he found this unacceptable in his reality. So I certainly have to respond to that in terms of the very fact that even before the Iraq conflict, far more American veterans were exposed to radiation to such an extent that you have far more Americans dying of radiation poisoning syndrome, what would be called a sickness in vernacular, but basically radiation syndrome, than you do Japanese civilians. That may sound hard to believe, but when you think of all of the atomic bomb tests that took place all over the Pacific, not only were American veterans exposed, but also civilians. And in terms of what the Americans were willing to put up in the air with atomic radiation that could be spread all over the civilian population, I want to first emphasize whatever you want to find out about atomic veterans, the diseases that they're suffering from, please call or contact the Atomic Veterans Organizations in terms of the support that they provide to veterans who suffer from radiation exposure, of which there are many thousands. And as a matter of fact, one of the most prominent civilians to die of radiation illness was John Wayne, who filmed in desert ghost towns that were exposed to blasts in the Nevada desert that were conducted by the United States government. There were no safety precautions for the American public, and those winds which I showed you, which blew balloon bombs all over the United States, which would have spread the viruses that the Japanese were willing to saturate the United States with, those same winds blew radiation. And they blew the radiation much further as particulate matter than any balloon bombs would ever go. There are people in New York who are dying of cancer because of atomic bomb tests in Nevada. And in terms of the American attitude towards what's safe in the air, in the 1950s, the Americans had a program, which has since been canceled, and whose name I actually forget, in which bombers were in the air 24 hours a day, specifically B-52s. This was part of the Air Force empire building of which I spoke under Curtis LeMay, where atomic weapons were considered this monopoly of the U.S. Air Force. And what happened was that on January 24th, 1961, one of these B-52s exploded in midair. Now, both of the Mark 39 thermonuclear weapons that it was carrying were, per regulations, primed. In other words, they only had one last phase of priming to go through before they exploded. So there's like 3 or 4 levels of encoding that go into one of these bombs before the mechanism kicks in and it blows. Now, these bombs were flying around all over the United States, since obviously they couldn't fly over Russian or Chinese airspace until the war began. So they were flying all over American cities and carrying these weapons, and one of them happened to blow up in the air on that date that I provided. This happened to be in North Carolina, I believe, and as a matter of fact, that's exactly where it was. It was near 2 cities that were in the vicinity, and this was Goldsboro and Faro. And when the plane blew up, the vast majority of the crew died. I don't believe there were any survivors. If they were terribly burned, and it would be a wonder if they survived upon hitting the ground, even if they hit the silk and pulled their parachutes. But the bombs themselves went into swampy land where it was impossible to retrieve them, so the U.S. government had to buy the land, and those bombs are still there today, primed, with only one step away from exploding. And their atomic power is literally something like 250 times that of the Hiroshima nuclear bomb. Now, to add to what the American government is willing to put into the air, this is something that Stanton Friedman worked on as a project, as a nuclear engineer. This is the Convair NB-36, where circa 1955, in which you had a nuclear-powered plane that was flying all over the United States, and at very low altitude, that reactor would actually microwave chickens in their roosts as it passed overhead. So what would happen is that this plane would be operated the way they were operating those dirigibles over the Socorro Desert and Aztec and Corona, where the crashes took place that we know now as Roswell. So what this plane would be accompanied by would be approximately, cut for a second. So this plane was followed by a wing of several support planes whenever it was flying in the air, and one of those planes at all times was filled with a troop of paratroopers whose job was to parachute to the ground if the plane ever blew, dropped its reactor, or crashed, and their job was to secure the entire site around that reactor until a cleanup procedure and decontamination could begin. So if they're willing to do this at any time, to the point where a hotline was set up to the president's office whenever this reactor went into meltdown in midair, and that hotline actually went into operation during one time when smoke alarms went off on that plane, if they're willing to do this over populated cities 24 hours a day with the B-52 program, several times a year during the Convair program, they have no problem whatsoever with what they did with the gondolas. And it needs to be emphasized that to add to that level of heartlessness, which most Americans don't understand, during the bikini tests for the bikini bombs, people lived on those islands. All of those people, literally hundreds of them, were moved off of those islands into exile, and after the atomic bomb tests took place, these people were moved back just so they could study how long it took them to die. Now, these people were later moved off again when there was a subsequent administration who felt that this kind of behavior was immoral. But in the meantime, hundreds of those people have, at least hundreds of them, in fact all of them, to one extent or another, have contracted cancer from radiation. When you take a look at everything the Allies did, from the Soviets with several ethnic tribes who they exterminated in Central Asia during H-bomb tests, just to see if they could be incinerated in a flash. When you take a look at the French blowing bombs in the Pacific with their tremendous environmental damage. When you take a look at the British, who considered Australia to be a nuclear dump site, doing atomic bomb tests in Australia, and you realize that there's a whole generation of Australian women who have had their thyroids removed because of thyroid cancer, because of all of the radiation that would accumulate in cow's milk. And when you realize the attitude that the Allies had towards testing radiation on their own civilian population, on their own militaries, how can Cyberbian doubt that they would conduct the tests which I have alluded to? One of the things Cyberbian was asking about is why would they be let loose with flares, because that was an integral part of the signaling for the operation. In terms of the accident that happened over Corona itself, the Japanese took advantage of a very spontaneous desert thunderstorm with all of its consequent lightning to immolate themselves out of view of the American support planes that were trying to box them into a confined area of airspace.